boys and girls, Adam Nicholas here for What Culture Wrestling, and as you may recall, there's been quite a few releases from WWE recently. Back on April 15th, we got the terrible day where a lot of people lost their jobs in a time when they really didn't need to. That still doesn't sit right with some of us, myself included, but ultimately it means we have had a lot of other content elsewhere from wrestlers who've been released, some of which have revolved around Chris Jericho's Talk is Jericho podcast, and the latest people to feature on that podcast are two of the guys who got released on that very day in Zack Ryder and Curt Hawkins, or as we're calling them now, Matt Cardona and whatever Curt Hawkins' name is. I'm only joking, of course, it's Brian Myers, and I definitely didn't just look at my notes to follow up on that. Either way, these podcasts that we've been getting from Jericho have been fascinating, and everybody's keen to see what these new WWE releases are going to talk about. Imagine there's going to be some deep dives on the company, and they're going to shine some light and maybe do a bit of bitching. However, for anybody who knows Ryder and Hawkins, I'm definitely going to have to call them that because I can't remember their other names. These guys are guys who love the company to bits. So if you come here looking for a lot of negativity about WWE, you're not going to get so much of it. But if you are looking for some insight into their time with the company, then have we got the video for you. Sit back, relax. I'm filming this on Friday. I don't know when you're going to see it, but let's dive into this podcast with Jericho and Matt Ryder. That'll fill. Matt Ryder, come on. These are the 10 things we learned from Matt Cardona and Brian Myers on Talk is Jericho. Number 10, Ryder's dad still calls him Zack. Now, one of the most satisfying sounds that anyone on planet Earth can hear is the sound of their own name. I think we'll all agree. Specifically, the name Adam tends to ring pretty well, shall we say, in the halls of What Culture. But nevertheless, it's something we all love, isn't it? Well, Matt Cardona, or Zack Ryder as he's been known for all this time, has had a bit of a funny situation going on with his dad. Having worked for WWE for the better part of 15 years, he's been known as Zack Ryder, and apparently he says his own father is struggling to call him Matt again, which is kind of weird because of all this time that he's still been his son. He's not just going to call him Zack Ryder as a character. You're his dad. He's obviously going to be called Matt. I don't know why this is such a big deal, but I guess it's a long time, maybe, and that's something, I guess. But then, having said all that, I have seen Zack Ryder's dad on WWE TV many times, and here I am, still calling him Zack Ryder's dad. So maybe he's got a point. Number 9, how action figures broke the ice. Now, this little tidbit is quite fascinating. I'll be honest, not very surprising, but still made for some interesting listening. As Zack Ryder and Curt Hawkins, as you know them, pretty good pals. In fact, best friends, you would imagine, in the business. Two guys who've literally come up through the company together, but it wasn't always like that. You see, apparently when they first began, they actually hated each other because they kind of had a similar look, which kind of immediately put them in the bracket of, well, this guy's competition, and you can only imagine WWE helped to fuel that along the way. And to add even more fuel onto that fire, they never actually wanted to be a tag team together, but then they got the magical breakthrough when they finally found out that each other was into wrestling figures, because of course they were waiting for that breakthrough. It broke the ice between the two, and they thought, well, this is pretty cool. I can hang out with a guy who understands what I understand, because we're both massive nerds, and I guess at the weekends we can go to Toys R Us together, so win-win. Number 8, they kept toy collecting quiet. Now, whenever you're making new friends, or you're going to a new workplace, or you're just creating new groups, new friendships along the way, we've all got that one little thing, haven't we, which you care about and you're passionate about, but you're very cautious to figure out whether or not you should just go blabbing about it from the minute go. For a lot of people, actually, that's probably wrestling, to be fair, but it's back in vogue now, so everything's fine. Well, in this situation, you've got two guys who are huge wrestling figure nerds, who are in the world of professional wrestling with a bunch of macho tough guys. These two things don't really match up quite well, and you can imagine that being the case, and it was confirmed as much by Ryder and Hawkins. Ryder jokes that he couldn't exactly just be like sitting around in the same locker room as The Undertaker and being like, hey, dead man, I just got your new figure and added it to my collection, because this guy's meant to be a peer. He's not meant to be someone you're fawning over and having his new figure. It's kind of a bit weird, isn't it? But hey-ho, that's the thing. I guess that's part of the territory when you got wrestling figures. But they did say, though, this was kind of a recognition that they'd come from a slightly different generation. Hawkins Hawkins would elaborate on this further when he said they'd come from a different era in the sense that they were the guys who then had bed sheets and they had merch and they had toys in their bedrooms. These were things that they got as a result of guys like Undertaker and Stone Cold from the past bringing forward those massive characters and them being huge fanboys of it. As a result, you get this weird divide where you get not the real guys, but the proper men's men, the wrestlers, you know what I mean. And then Zack Ryder and Curt Hawkins, who maybe struggled a little bit to distinguish the line between being a fan and being a wrestler. It's something Hawkins feels is very romanticised when it comes to his generation, and if anything, this might even be one of the reasons why Vince McMahon never really got on board with them as main event guys. Number 7, the Edgeheads were inspired by Entourage. Now, at one point in their careers, Ryder and Hawkins were asked by Michael Hayes, of all people, to come up with something new that people hadn't seen before. If they were going to get over in this company, if they were going to bring something to the table, he needed to see something different from them. So the two of them put their heads together and thought, what could we possibly do? They were both huge fans of Entourage, and so they decided to kind of take a page out of that playbook. And unfortunately, no, I do not mean glamorizing sex, drugs and rock and roll, but I do mean being two little groupies who follow the main guy around, and as such, enter Edge. They thought that the idea of them ghosting Edge as his little groupies would be quite cool and something maybe the fans would get attached to, so because they had a similar look and a style, they decided to get in touch with Edge. Hawkins got his email address and said he politely sent him an email, and can you imagine the nerves of this, like hoping that this works out for you, and then as it happens, you happen to be sending an email to the most receptive guy on the planet and just a good egg in Edge, who was very much for the idea. So as a result, the Edgeheads were born. We got this wonderful, the twin-esque magic with these three, where they could just all completely rotate in the ring to help Edge get some sneaky victories. It fit the character, and to be honest, it was a great launching pad for these two guys, and they made a best friend on top of that in Edge and a mentor that they're never going to forget. So send that email that you're thinking about sending, because you just never know. Number 6, neither man understood how fortunate they were. This one was probably one of the most interesting anecdotes we got from this podcast, in the fact that these two kind of shone a light on just how long it's been for them and how young they were when they first got their start in WWE. They signed their contracts at the age of 20, but by the time they were just 21, they were working on the road against The Undertaker every single night. Just try to put that into perspective for a second, because that's a lot to take in. But as you can imagine, and I guess touching back on that thing that Hawkins said about it being a different generation, this almost spoiled them a little bit, because they kind of thought this was the natural progression of things. You went to a wrestling school, you did a bit of wrestling, you went on the independent scene for a teeny tiny little bit, then you signed with WWE, and the next minute you're working The Undertaker. But as we all know, that's not the case. As the two reminisced on the podcast, you can tell that they're very fortunate and only really starting to appreciate just how fortunate they were to have had such a wonderful opportunity at that time. There's a lot of guys who bust their ass and just never get to do it. But Zack Ryder did say that even despite the fact they had all these wonderful opportunities and they were very fortunate, he still remembers his days down in Deep South and still has nightmares to this day about them, even if it did toughen him up as a performer. Number 5, Ryder's WrestleMania pipe dream. Now this one kind of boils down to expectation versus reality, because at WrestleMania 24 we've got Edge versus The Undertaker. Huge match, great match as well, and the main event of that Mania, and Zack Ryder and Curt Hawkins came down to interfere in the main event. And for some reason, because of that scenario that happened, Ryder got in his head that the next year at WrestleMania 25 there was going to be a triple threat match between Edge, Ryder and Hawkins. Now, it must be very easy to get caught up in it all, and this must have been very exciting. They've just essentially, in a kind of way, main evented WrestleMania, so maybe they're thinking that's the kind of area they belong in. But as WrestleMania 25 rolls round, they find themselves in a pre-show match as a tag team. Now, to be fair to them, they do kind of say this tongue-in-cheek, and Zack Ryder is being quite playful when he talks about this, and what a scenario that would have been, by the way, but I guess he let himself go down the rabbit hole a little bit and he paid for it. But he does say that he and Hawkins, because of this fortunate run they had, honestly felt like it was just never going to end. They literally shot up like this, and if only they'd known where it might end up. Number 4, Hawkins worked in FCW unpaid for a year. In 2009, when Hawkins was working for WWE, he says he remembers the time when his travel was cut, and as such, he started to feel like the writing might just be on the wall. So, in an attempt to kind of bet on himself and actually better himself as well, he went to John Laurinaitis and said, would he send him back down to developmental, where he could go down there and just work his backside off and outwork everywhere and everyone, and hopefully come back a better performer. Laurinaitis agreed this would be a good idea. That's a good thing, right? Well, sort of, because he also then said that WWE wouldn't pay him for the time because they weren't asking him to go and do this. It was something he was choosing to do, and if he was going to do it, he'd have to do it unpaid. But as the saying goes, you've got to suffer for your art, and wrestling is indeed, whether you like it or not, an art form. So what did he do? He went down, he went back to developmental, was unpaid, and said he lived in a apartment, his words not mine, with Trent Beretta of all people, while he tried to figure it all out. This is a guy 23 years old. He's decided to go and rough it in the hopes that he can come and find his way back to the main roster. Jericho was absolutely fascinated by this, as you can imagine he would be. It's a pretty interesting story. I'm trying to think what I was doing at 23, and I don't think it was that. Still, I might have been sleeping on someone else's couch, just not while I was training to be a wrestler. Either way, this did end up working, I guess, for Hawkins in the end, because by May 2010, he found himself back on the main roster to an extent in a tag team with Lance Archer, of all people. Just, he wasn't quite a murder Hawk yet. Number 3, Triple H told Ryder off for dyeing his hair. Now, as you may remember, Zack Ryder was incredibly pretty well over at one point in WWE, and obviously this is a guy who did it all by himself. He made this happen for himself and was seeing the benefits from the WWE universe, who appreciated how much time and effort he was putting into it. I mean, we'd reached a point where you couldn't go to any arena in anywhere with WWE where fans weren't chanting for Ryder. This guy was red hot at the time, and you can hear he sort of reflects very fondly about this time. I mean, who wouldn't? Now imagine you're in Madison Square Garden, WWE's house by Vince McMahon's own words, the place he loves the most, and everybody in there is chanting your name because you made that happen. And as such, they're chanting your name so much, in fact, that actually it's distracting from what's happening in the ring. Well, there's a match between John Morrison and Dolph Ziggler at Survivor Series 2011 taking place in MSG, and the fans are just going wild. They're not really paying attention, they just want to chant Ryder's name. You've got to think you've done something right here, right? Well, wrong. Wrong indeed. At a time when Ryder had just dyed his hair, changed his look ever so slightly, Triple H pulled him over to one side as all this was going on, and he's probably thinking, he's going to tell me how great I am. Maybe he's going to say, well done, you're going to get a push. And instead, he gives him a bollocking for changing his look without confirming it with anybody in the back of WWE, and ultimately completely crushes him. And all of this happiness in a moment that he really should be celebrating. So ultimately we get the exact opposite to what he was expecting. Triple H chews him out, asks him why he dyed his hair without getting any permission from WWE, which just seems ridiculous. But as we know, it's not about that. This was more about the fact that Ryder had got himself over when he wasn't supposed to. As Jericho elaborates on when he says that basically the translation for all this is that you got yourself over when you weren't supposed to, and now you're being punished. Number 2, how Ryder changed WWE policy. Well, we might as well stick with the theme of Zack Ryder being so good at getting himself over that he completely changes things in WWE. And he didn't get a bollocking this time, but he did manage to change something that had been going on for quite some time. You see, on the Raw after every WrestleMania for quite a long time, WWE would hold this meeting where they'd give the usual grab the brass ring conversation and try to inspire a bunch of people. This could be your year. Go out there and take it. But because Zack Ryder had stolen the show one year, as Curt Hawkins recalls, WWE decided to completely scrap this idea, to the point where they were so against the fact that Ryder had managed to get himself over, they completely canned these yearly meetings where they wanted to inspire people to do just that. I mean, what is wrong with these people? Ultimately, this must have been so depressing, because the reward for all your hard work and toil is them saying to you that ultimately, if they don't want you to have it, then you're not gonna have it. And that brass ring, poof, completely fictional. And number 1, with a bullet, Ryder's biggest regret. Now, based on the previous 2 entries of this, you can understand why Zack Ryder might not have been so keen to try and get himself back over ever again. I mean, look what happened the last time. The guy worked his arse off. He was so creative. He got himself over to the point where people were cheering his name over the top of other people. I even remember once he did it so much that his name was getting cheered and interrupted a promo by The Rock, of all people, which is just mad to think. And yeah, he's done all this. He's got himself over, and the reward was to be completely berated and completely shit on, essentially, for want of a better phrase, and punished ultimately. So it's no surprises then that we would find Ryder kind of stuck in mid-card turmoil, because what is he supposed to do? The guy at the very top doesn't see him as a guy who can main event, so he can't try that hard, but he also needs to keep his job, so he needs to kind of float around the middle and do as he's told. So I mean, if you look at the transformation as well, body-wise, Zack Ryder got himself into exactly the kind of shape that you'd imagine the company wanted from him, but they just didn't do anything with him. They didn't see him that way, and ultimately he had to figure out what he was going to do and what that meant for him. And unfortunately, what it didn't mean was having a chat with Vince McMahon, because despite, as you can imagine, feeling like you're stuck in a bit of a weird situation, he never actually ended up having a one-on-one chat with Vince McMahon. And this is something that Ryder says is a big regret of his. He didn't go to Vince directly, and while he was selling merch like hotcakes, the guy was red hot, but he never really went to Vince because ultimately they didn't have anything for him. If Ryder could go back and change it, that seems to be like the one thing he would correct in his time there. But ultimately, I think you're being a bit harsh on yourself, mate. You've done everything physically possible here, and ultimately, they just weren't that into it. Nothing you can do there. So there you have it. Those are all the things that we learned from Matt Cardona and Brian Myers on the Talk Is Jericho podcast. I'm sure there were some other little anecdotes that you enjoyed from there that maybe you want to share in the comments down below. Please do that. Don't forget to like and share. Hit the old subscribe button if you haven't already. You can find the original article for this at whatculture.com/WWE. That's by Jamie Kennedy. Go and give that a read. You can also find What Culture on Twitter at WhatCultureWWE. You can find me on Twitter if that's your thing at It's Adam Nicholas, or if you would just like some more videos, you can find some just over here. My name is Adam Nicholas. This has been What Culture Wrestling, and I'll see you next time.